this October 16th work session and the final work session with our esteemed city manager, John Reese. So thank you all for being here. And I think our first presentation is a feel-good presentation, Rivers to Ridges.
The pressure's on.
Yeah, it better make us feel good, just saying, right?
Hello, Mayor, Council, and City Manager. Thanks for letting us be here this afternoon. My name is Craig Carnegie. I'm the Parks and Open Space Division Manager, and I'm here with Shelley Miller, our Ecological Services and GIS Supervisor. And we are here to share with you the story of the Rivers to Ridges partnership and everything that is accomplished over the last 15 years. This is a story of regional collaboration that has long-lasting positive impacts for the entire community, including ensuring a more climate-resilient future and protecting biodiversity, securing access to nature and recreation for people, and making our city overall more livable. I've been in front of council a few times before to talk with you about the values and benefits of our city's parks, open spaces, and recreation facilities, which, on a side note, we are now making big strides towards improving the condition of our parks and recreation system, thanks to the passage of the recent capital bond and operating levy. And we'll be back in front of you in a few months with more detailed information on how well that has been working and going. But back to the Rivers to Ridges accomplishments. That slide for you. The natural landscape of our local area is what makes Lane County and the city of Eugene such a special place to live and work. This landscape is cherished by our residents. It's one of the main reasons why people choose to live here. From the forested ridges and buttes to the rivers, wetlands, and prairies, the natural landscape in our area is one of, if not the most valuable asset our community has. Protecting this landscape is critical for our future prosperity. And the history of Eugene shows a deep understanding of the need to protect the special places within this landscape. From Hendricks Park, Spencer and Skinner Buttes, the Amazon Creek Corridor, to the Riverfront and Ruth Bascom Path, South Hills Ridgeline, and the West Eugene Wetlands. All of these places were created and protected by the will of the people of Eugene, and we are grateful and proud for what folks before us did to set aside these places for future benefit. Protecting and stewarding this landscape now and into the future is a great honor and responsibility held by many in this community, including those of you on this council. This is why in 2003, the council, along with other local agencies and nonprofit organizations, endorsed a bold vision to take steps towards securing regional parks and open spaces. Planning for this regional vision began soon after the West Eugene wetlands were established, and there are a number of local plans from the county, city, Willamette, and state that gave direction and set policy on the subject of parks and open spaces for the metropolitan area. In 2000, the Eugene and Springfield City Councils, Lane County Board of Commissioners, and Willamette Park and Recreation Board met and agreed by unanimous consensus to proceed with and jointly fund a metropolitan regional parks and open space study, which became the Rivers to Ridges vision. This vision was developed based on extensive input received between December 2001 and May 2003 from citizens, elected officials, and staff from local, state, and federal agencies. The vision laid out a roadmap of what a cohesive regional open space system could look like, identifying key properties, trails, and habitat corridors needed in order to complete this vision. The intent was then and has been to improve the quality of life for residents by protecting and enhancing the region's land and water resources and provide environmental education and outdoor recreation opportunities. On the map, the vision included a string of interconnected green spaces from Fern Ridge Reservoir out west, across the West Eugene wetlands, up through the South Hills Ridgeline and over to Buford Park and Mount Pisgah to the east, then across the middle fork of the Willamette River into the Thurston Hills, and circling back up the Coburg Hills, then westward along the McKenzie River until it tied back into North Eugene and back to Fern Ridge. The hope is that someday people will be able to hike, bike, or boat most of this system and experience continuous natural areas right within the metro area. As a confirmation of the collaborative effort that created this regional vision, the following elected and appointed bodies endorsed this vision by unanimous consent: Eugene City Council, Eugene Planning Commission, Lane County Board of Commissioners, Springfield City Council, Springfield Planning Commission, Willamette Parks and Recreation Board. Since that time, the Rivers to Ridges partnership has grown to 17 partners, including several state and federal agencies, watershed councils, land trusts, and nonprofits. and this partnership has made great strides towards implementing the endorsed vision over the last 15 years. There have been 16 miles of hard new surface paths built, 29 miles of soft surface trails built, over 6,200 acres of land placed into conservation, over 6,700 acres of habitat restored, 59 stream miles open for fish passage, and over 2 million native trees, shrubs, and other plants planted. For almost every dollar the City of Eugene has spent to implement this vision within our jurisdictional area, there has been another dollar leveraged from grants and donations. This has helped us double our ability to get work done. And now Shelley is going to talk with you a little bit about Eugene-specific projects implemented as part of the Rivers to Ridges vision.
Thanks, everyone, for welcoming us here. As Craig mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific projects across the area that have been implemented and benefited from this partnership. This map is showing an oblique aerial view of our system, and this includes land owned by the city and our partners. I think it's sort of an interesting view to look at and to see some of the accomplishments and the progress we've made towards a connected green space landscape. The properties highlighted in red are ones I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. I'm going to start at Delta Ponds. So Delta Ponds is a 150-acre park in sort of North Eugene. It's a formal gravel pit area that had served their purpose. And so it came under city ownership, and through the assistance and funding from a variety of partners, including the City of Eugene, the Army Corps of Engineers, state parks, NOAA Fisheries, the Bureau of Land Management, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, $9.1 million have come to that area to do both habitat restoration in terms of 2.5 miles of side channel habitat, which has been reconnected. They've planted nearly 100,000 trees, shrubs, and other plants. And a series of accessible trails and paths have been built across much of the site, with the final piece slated for construction from bond funding and a grant in 2021. And that will bring a bridge and boardwalk to the area between Delta Highway and Goodpasture Island Road to create about a 1-mile loop in that area. And we have volunteers actively engaged across our parks, but here in particular, we have some really passionate volunteers who like to get out on kayaks and pull aquatic weeds and do other work. And this is a picture from a recent work party out there. Wild Iris Ridge is in the southwest part of the city. This is a 250-acre park. It's at one of the entrances is at the intersection of Bailey Hill and Bertelson Road. It's the westernmost portion of the Ridgeline Park System. And here we were able to collaborate with the Longtime Watershed Council and also the Bureau of Land Management to bring funding to this park to conduct habitat restoration work and also fuels reduction work to help reduce catastrophic wildfire risk in the area. And this habitat type that you're seeing here is a rare sort of oak savanna prairie habitat, of which there's less than 5% left in the Willamette Valley. So that's a priority for all of the, or most of the partners in the Rivers to Ridges partnership. And in 2017, we were able to build 1.3 miles of trail, which is right now the westernmost portion of the Ridgeline Trail system. And that was done in collaboration with the Northwest Youth Corps. Golden Gardens, now shifting over to the Bethel community, the northwest part of Eugene. This is a 220-acre, largely undeveloped park, but it does have soft surface paths around the ponds. There's a lot of wildlife viewing. You can catch a beautiful sunset out there if you haven't been out there. And there's also a large number of people that go fishing out there. We're currently in the process of doing a feasibility study to site sports complex here using in part 2018 bond funding. The ponds were enhanced in 2009 to improve public safety access for both the public and also emergency services, and also to improve habitat. And this area is now home to one of the best populations of western pond turtle, which is a rare species in our area. And we received a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in cooperation with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2018 to further enhance the habitat for pond turtles, and that included fencing off their nesting habitat to protect them from predators, and also planting some aquatic plants. You can see a middle school student here is helping us plant wapato bulbs, also known as duck potato. And these fence nests were a success. We had our first documented western pond turtle nestlings hatch, and that's what you can see in the in the left-hand side here. There's two turtles here that are emerging from their nest, so was exciting for us. And this work we're hoping can help potentially keep the turtles off the endangered species list. A project that we've been working on that has really benefited from, I think, evolved from and benefited through this partnership is some funding we received from the Bureau of Land Management for wildland-urban interface fuels reduction work. So this is work that helps reduce the likelihood of catastrophic sort of canopy wildfire. It improves access for firefighting should a fire break out. And it also, for us, is a multiple benefit in that we can also restore the habitat that I talked about in terms of the more open oak, woodland, savanna, and prairie habitats. And it can open up areas that were really overgrown with thickets of invasive blackberry and pears and cherries and other shrubs to allow for public access as well. And so we've done work in 5 parks, 4 in the Ridgeline, and then also Skinner Butte over the last 4 years, and done work on about 600 acres. So not every part of all of these parks has been touched, but we have done work on about 600 acres shown here in orange, and brought in $440,000 across the system to do this work. And I think about it as creating sort of a landscape scale defensible space. There's some talk about defensible space around people's homes. And so this is thinking about it at a city level, that we're creating a space that our fire departments could go in and treat should some wildfire breakout. We've also done a fair amount of outreach with postcards, public service announcements. We've put up signs in our kiosks at our Ridgeline trails in particular about this work. And we've just applied for a new 3-year agreement to continue this work through the BLM. Suzanne Arlie Park is one of the places where we've applied this funding in southeast Eugene. This is the easternmost edge of the Ridgeline Park system behind LCC. It's also our largest park at just over 500 acres. This photo here is from a drone, and you can kind of see the openings here that have been made by some work with large machinery and hand crews to sort of take out the thickets of blackberry and other things that were creating these what are called ladder fuels that can bring fire up into the canopy. So that's the type of work that we're doing with this. Another thing I want to point out here is the group of people gathered there are part of a tour we call the Field Operations Group, or FOG, from Rivers to Ridges. And so this is a group of partners, staff, and also people that are just interested in the kind of work that the partnership does. And they get together regularly and go on site visits or have sometimes office visits to sort of share techniques, lessons learned, learn from each other about what's worked or not worked. And for Suzanne Arlie Park, we had one of these meetings in the spring, and we could see sort of the fruits of our labors in terms of these, some wildflowers came out that had been suppressed by all the shrubs that had been growing over them and were just in the seed bank and were just blooming. They weren't seeded or planted. It was a very great story to be able to show. Master planning is underway for Suzanne Arlie Park, and there should be a public meeting this winter. The last thing I want to mention quickly is the Rivers to Ridges partnership has been undertaking ecological burning for over 30 years, and this is really bringing fire back to a landscape that was burned by indigenous peoples for millennia and adapted. There's a fire-adapted ecosystem that evolved that has been degraded over time and also created this somewhat hazardous fuels situation in terms of wildfire. And so this is a partnership activity that we've been doing for a long time. It couldn't happen without partnership in terms of none of us having all of the staff and ability to get this work done. We do follow strict safety protocols. We work with LRAPA and the City Council to get exemptions to be able to conduct the burning. And we work closely with our own fire department and other fire jurisdictions in the area to implement the work. This year we had planned for up to 900 acres to burn, not in the city, but throughout the partnership. But we ended up not burning any because the prescription, so we call it prescribed fire, because there's a certain suite of characteristics that we need to have in terms of weather, moisture, and that sort of thing. And we got some of those early rains that created a damp environment that we thought would create too much smoke. We started having things green up, and it just wasn't conducive to burning, so we're not going to burn any, actually, this year. Last year, we did burn 700 acres, which was a record for the partnership. I think I'm now going to turn it back over to Craig.
So you can see there has been a great deal of work accomplished over the last 15 years, and now the partnership has recently started a 20-year vision refresh, which will be complete hopefully by 2021 or 2022 and chart a course for another era of great accomplishments. And we really cannot underestimate the positive impacts of this work. It helps the city achieve its goals on all three legs of the sustainability stool: economic, social, and environment, and demonstrates how collaboration across organizations can get so much more work done. A few months ago, I was at a parks conference which included staff and elected officials from cities all over the country, big cities with big park systems: New York, San Francisco, Denver, Seattle, Chicago, and even some from outside the US like Vancouver, BC, and Melbourne, Australia. And I can tell you, while those cities may have bigger budgets and more acreage of parkland than we do, the work that has been done locally through the Rivers to Ridges partnership is as great a story about protecting and maintaining green space in a city as any other story I heard at that conference. Our parks and open space system and staff can truly stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the greatest and greenest cities in the country. And that says a lot about where we live and work. And I'd like to thank you for your support and letting us present to you today. Hopefully you will come out and we can take you on a hike. We'd be thrilled to have you. And also, I'd just like to extend a personal thank you to our city manager, John Reese, for all his support over the years.
Thank you so much. Are there counselors that wish to? Greg, anybody else in the queue? Greg, go right for it.
So going back to the Susan Arlie Park, I know that there was talk of several years ago having a commercial development either adjacent to the park or part of the park. There was talk that, there's people who were interested in purchasing the land and then developing the land. You know if that's still the case?
There has been some progress on residential development, large lots around the area, but no commercial development that I'm aware of at all.
Okay.
Any other? Alan?
Yeah, and I noticed in your partnership slide, OWEB wasn't in that partnership, although you mentioned them. Is that because they're a funder and not a partner?
Right. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, for those that don't know, that your OWEB gives grants to people, partnerships like this around the state, to Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
Yeah, all the members in the partnership actually have some land base that they work from, whether it's, a nonprofit watershed council or agency. And yeah, OWEB is more of a funding kind of conduit or funding stream.
Yeah, so maybe you can explain a little bit about what all these partners end up doing within the partnership.
Yeah,
General characterizations.
general, yeah. I would say all of the partners became involved because they could help implement some part of the vision, which includes things such as education. So we have REN and some of the watershed councils that do more educational type outreach. The Mount Pisgah Arboretum only recently joined, but they're certainly a part that can help us with the outreach and education component. As Craig mentioned, a lot of the entities do have land in the area or influence how people steward the land in the area. And so the partners contribute in a variety of ways, but those are the main ways. And in our process that we're undergoing right now to sort of refresh the vision, we are talking about, are there people that are missing from, or groups that are missing from this suite of partners to reach out to?
Yeah, do you guys have any idea of how many jobs or the economic impact of the partnership?
A great question. I think it's something that we could possibly study a little bit more of in the future. I mean, we are interested in kind of the ecosystems analysis work, and we've done some of that work locally, but not particularly on the jobs part. But that's a great
Yeah,
question.
the jobs and economic impact of this stuff is, I bet, pretty substantial.
Yeah,
Because it is a large project. When you look at this entire map, all the things that are involved here have a great impact on our economy as well as our livability. And I think that livability aspects of all this stuff is extremely important. I think the comments that you made about how well Eugene stacks up against even much larger cities is a case in point. And I think that's our competitive advantage, is all of this stuff, which also, and all of these open spaces, parks, and the Ridgeline Trail, and all the things that we've done over the decades to make this place a much more livable place, is going to become more and more important, which is why when we get to the SDC methodology, I think having full funding for this kind of stuff only enhances the economic viability of this community. And while there is a trade-off between affordability, I think it's not an or thing, it's an and thing. We should be doing both affordable housing and also all of this enhancement of our open spaces and parks, because that is our competitive advantage, which makes this place such a great place to live, and people who retire want to stay here. Not that I know anybody like that. True. Yes.
Chris?
Thank you. This is really great work, and I think it's important to acknowledge the long-term vision that's gone into this. I can remember when I first started working at Willamette Lane in the late 80s, we were talking about Middle Fork work to be done that would be incorporated into a larger vision, and 30 years later, that vision is playing out, and it's where you have to start imagining what you could have far back and then systematically and methodically working towards getting there. And I think that's really what we can be most proud of, is that just one step at a time, one park at a time, one acquisition at a time, one development at a time, we're achieving a vision. And so that's a really, I think, important aspect to this. It's not something that happens quickly or easily or cheaply. It's something that takes a lot of will to do. And so what I'm most proud of is what we see today is the result of a lot of people over a long period of time having the will to make this happen. And hopefully that will continue on into the future so that we can make sure that there's still more work to be done and that we can continue to see that vision take place. So congratulations. It's nice to see where we are now. We're way from the beginning, but we're also way from the end.
I'll just jump in also with a couple of comments, which is of course, the beauty of this plan is that it really impacts the whole city, so that you're really reaching the different corners of the city in terms of creating those park amenities and improvements. I am struck by the fires reduction work. We hear questions, particularly from folks living in the South Hills, about their concern about the fuel strategy there, and so it's really helpful to see this map and see where that work is happening and know that that work is going on, and that collaboration with Northwest Youth Corps feels like a very, very important and very timely. So I have a lot of admiration for the fact that the city is ahead of this one and paying attention to that. And I'll just say, I've been to a lot of these sites and have walked the Wild Iris Ridge, and it's really a stunning addition to the park system. And it's an absolutely beautiful walk, and you get a vantage that you don't get anywhere else because it looks west. And really beautiful, beautiful work and a great partnership. So I thank you for this, both laying it out for us and just doing the work over 15 years, which is really phenomenal. So great report. Any other comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we are now ready for a transportation update, Climate Action Plan 2.0.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us here today. My name is Chelsea Clinton. I'm the Sustainability Manager, and I'm here with my colleague Rob Innerfeld, who's the Transportation Planning Manager. Today, we'll give you a quick update on 3 items related to transportation. First, the Climate Action Plan 2.0, focusing specifically on the transportation fuels gap strategies. We'll also talk about the electric vehicle strategy and then the Transportation System Plan Implementation Plan. So, of course, we'll start off by talking about the CRO and the Climate Action Plan. As you all know well by now, the Climate Recovery Ordinance, or the CRO, includes 4 climate action goals. 2 goals are for the city as an organization, and 2 are for the community. So today we'll be focusing on the community side. The first community goal calls for a 50% reduction of fossil fuel use by 2030 compared to 2010 use. And the second community goal is a science-based goal that calls for a 7.6% annual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. These goals, along with community resiliency, are the focus of the CAP 2.0 process. You may also recall our CAP 2.0 equation, the organizing framework for the project. The equation summarizes major components that will help us reach our CRO goals. Those components include the city's internal climate action plan, or the ICAP, the Eugene Climate Collaborative Actions, or the ECC actions, state and federal action, and the GAP strategies. As the equation shows, the combination of these actions need to equal about 790,000 metric tons carbon equivalent in order to reach our 2030 CRO goals. The ICAP includes the actions the city is taking to reduce operational carbon footprint. While it represents less than 1% of community emissions, it is important for the city to do its part and lead the way for our community. The ECC actions include the actions that 12 organizations, including the City of Eugene, have committed to, and these organizations have significant oversight and impact on our community-wide fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions, or have the ability to affect or alter systems that will enable the community to adapt to climate change. So they're large organizations. This component of the equation captures what these organizations plan to do over the next 5 to 10 years that will impact our climate work. Next, the state and federal action. State and federal action will be necessary to reach the CRO goals. Our last modeling around the Oregon Cap and Invest bill from the 2019 legislative session is included here. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass, and it's unclear what form future legislation may take, but we're hopeful that the legislature will revisit this in some form in the 2020 session. And then finally, the GAP strategies. These are high-impact practices that, if implemented, will help the community make significant progress towards filling the gaps between the sum of the first 3 circles and that 790,000 metric ton goal. And I'll talk more about those in a moment, but it's important to remember those strategies don't have an actor connected to them at this time, so it's something we're asking you all to consider. As you've seen before, Eugene's emissions can be simplified to fit into 3 buckets: consumption, which is like the cell phone or the food we eat or construction materials are the examples we have up there. Transportation fuels, which is primarily gasoline and diesel fuel that goes into our vehicles. and energy used in buildings, so primarily electricity and natural gas that we use to heat and cool our homes. Today we'll focus on transportation fuels, which is the largest source of emissions that are emitted within our geographic boundary. It's about 53% of what's emitted here locally. And as I said, it primarily includes gasoline and diesel. Before we move to GAP strategies, I wanted to take a moment to highlight what we're already doing that will impact that transportation fuels bucket. The city and community partners are already working on a number of initiatives that will make a big impact. First and foremost, I want to emphasize the transportation system plan combined with the compact development strategies included in New Vision Eugene are the central actions of the CAP 2.0. They are the foundation of all of our climate work. Implementing these plans as adopted is that foundational element, and it's important to everything else that we'll talk about today. So starting there is important. Fully implemented, those actions are forecasted to lead to an annual emissions reduction of about 240,000 metric tons by 2030. And I think it's just important to emphasize that you all have already shown leadership by adopting those plans and will continue to do so as those come back to you during the implementation phase. Looking more broadly at community partner actions around transportation, LTD is doing a lot of great work through the Moving Ahead and Transit Tomorrow processes, and programs like Peace Health Rides are also important to our community as they help with that first and last mile transportation option. And then I included a link at the bottom of this slide with a list of a number of community climate actions for folks who are interested. But back to the equation. The actions that I just spoke about are a sample of a significant body of work in the city and other community partners are undertaking, and that's included in that ECC action, that second circle. And as you can see, that's about 40% of what we need to get to our CRO goals in 2030. Last fall, City Council asked staff to come back with additional actions that could be taken to fill the gap. The chart above includes a mix of actions suggested by the Sustainability Commission, staff, and the project consultant team, Good Company. Today, we're going to focus on the transportation fuels actions included in that red box. We'll be coming back to you in future work sessions this fall to take a deeper dive on the other sections as well. And you've seen these actions in just a different format in a document that we presented earlier this year as well. So I'll walk through this chart quickly now, but again, we'll come back to this several times over the fall. And I'm hoping that this reminds you of like your budget committee work, so channel that right now. And I'll actually start at the bottom. So our goal is down there, 790,000 metric tons. And then if we go to the second row, you can see highlighted the Eugene Climate Collaborative actions. All added up, we think that'll be about 320,000 metric tons by 2030 annually. And so the rest of these actions are possible actions that you could choose to take ownership of, I suppose is the word to use, and put the metric tons over in the right-hand columns. We'll come back and talk to you about the first section, which is energy used in buildings actions on October 28th, so we'll do a deep dive then. And today, like I said, we'll focus on those transportation actions, and then at a work session following those, we'll talk about the last ones. Some of them overlap for sure, so it's not a just simple addition, but we can talk more about that as we go along. So today, those transportation fuels gap strategies. So the first is the transportation system plan is updated to meet the CRO goals with the potential reduction of about 30 to, depending on which option is chosen, 30 or 70,000 metric tons. And the second is implementing an electric vehicle strategy. So the electric vehicle strategy, we did the modeling, and this can be scaled up or down, but just for conversation's sake today, about if we replace about 5,000 gasoline-powered vehicles with EVs, we estimate that'll be about a 22,000 metric ton reduction annually. And we're working with the state to understand what an achievable goal will look like, and we'll get back to you with that information when we can. And at this time, I'm going to hand it off to Rob, who's going to talk about both of those in a lot more detail.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council. I'll start by talking about the electric vehicle strategy, and then I'll review transportation system plan implementation. When the City Council adopted the Transportation System Plan in 2017, you provided direction to develop a strategy to incorporate new and emerging transportation technologies into the TSP with the goal of 50% electric vehicles by 2030 and 90% by 2050. And this electric vehicle strategy that was provided in your packet is a first step in that direction. We subsequently hired Lane Council of Governments to conduct research and identify potential strategies for increasing EV use in Eugene with an emphasis on actions that the city could undertake. The actions in this strategy were informed by the LCOG report, interviews and collaborative planning with internal and external stakeholders, and best practice research of municipalities that encourage EV use. This strategy specifically focuses on actions that the city can implement within the next 5 years to encourage electric vehicle growth. It is designed to be regularly updated. It focuses on where we can make the most difference and have the most leverage. And it looks not only at passenger vehicles, but also other kinds of mobility devices such as electric bikes and electric scooters that we refer to as small electric vehicles or SEVs. Within this plan, the actions within this plan fit within 4 sub-strategies that you can see up on the screen: charging infrastructure, personal vehicles, fleets and shared mobility, education and outreach, and targets and tracking. Some of the concerns and barriers related to EVs that are addressed by the actions in this strategy include limited charging infrastructure, the higher sticker price of new electric vehicles compared to vehicles with internal combustion engines, and consumer confusion about how EVs work and how to charge them. To give you a sense of what's in this plan, I will next review a handful of the short-term actions within the strategy. There were short, medium, and long-term actions within the strategy, but keep in mind it's just a 5-year plan. Oh, sorry, yeah. So I'll just be going in order from upper left. Explore electric vehicle and small electric vehicle parking and charging infrastructure requirements in new multifamily and commercial construction projects that include parking. Establish EV and SEV-ready requirements for new city buildings or major retrofits, and develop a plan to strategically retrofit existing city buildings. For city parking facilities, so like the Overpark, for example, develop policies and practices to ensure efficient use of the existing charging stations in these facilities, and assess needs for installation of additional chargers for both standard and small electric vehicles. Work with partners to develop pilot projects for deployment of electric vehicle car share and shared mobility devices such as e-bikes and electric scooters. And in particular, this idea was suggested by the equity panel of the Climate Action Plan. Develop community engagement strategies, prioritizing collaboration and strategies that help marginalized communities transition to electric vehicles and small electric vehicles. And then lastly, use greenhouse gas modeling to refine and set a target for electric vehicle adoption for the 2035 sunset date of the Transportation System Plan. And we're working with the state to understand their emerging forecasting around the rates of electric vehicle adoption. So I last came to you to talk about the Transportation System Plan a little more than a year ago, and I presented to you on work that had been done by LCOG and the Oregon Department of Transportation to model the potential fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions from implementing the TSP, and we found that there was a gap. The implemented TSP would achieve a 40% reduction in fossil fuel use by 2035, while the Climate Recovery Ordinance calls for a 50% reduction by 2030. Since then, we've continued to work with these agencies and also the Department of Land Conservation and Development on development of a revised version of this model, which is called Vision Eval. One advantage of Vision Eval is that it will enable LCOG staff to do sensitivity testing and see what the impacts are of changing different inputs into the model. So for example, the model has as an input currently tripling the rate of biking in Eugene. What if it only doubled? What would the impact of that be? What if it quadrupled? So it'll give us the ability to try out different inputs, and test different ideas. Previously, we relied on ODOT staff to do this, and we were really limited in the number of scenarios that we could run in the model. And we expect to have the initial modeling results later this year. One thing to keep in mind with this modeling work is that there are only 2 ways that we can decrease fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation: less driving and more fuel-efficient vehicles. Everything we do towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation has to achieve one or both of these objectives. So I'm now going to give you a brief update on the status of implementing the transportation system plan. When adopting the TSP, City Council directed staff to develop a strategy to incorporate new and emerging transportation technologies into the TSP. To achieve this, we contracted with the Sustainable Cities Initiative at the University of Oregon and work with 2 programs there, Sustainable City Year and Urbanism Next. They produced a report called Navigating New Mobility that looks at how to create a local context in which the introduction of autonomous vehicles and other forms of emerging mobility can help us to achieve our vision and goals and not detract from them. We would like, and one thing we'd like to do is to schedule a time for Becky Steckler, who was the lead person who worked on this report, to come and present it to you, because there's a lot of really interesting information in it. Moving on from that, a key action item in the transportation system plan is developing a formal transportation demand management regulatory structure through which developers and employers would be required to integrate transportation demand management into what they do. And we're about to issue a request for proposals to hire a consultant to work with us on this. We'll also soon be launching a Smart Trips program focused on reducing driving trips to and from downtown Eugene. We're also working on a lot of other programs and projects that help implement the TSP, including Vision Zero, Moving Ahead, for which you have a public hearing with the LTD board next Monday, Central Eugene in Motion, Franklin Boulevard Transformation, and Beltline. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about these. Also, we have an exciting slate of construction projects coming up next year that will enhance transportation safety and active transportation throughout Eugene. These include rehabilitation and lighting of a significant section of the West Bank Path, a rebuild of the Irving-Hunsaker River Road intersection to make it safer for all modes, a protected bikeway on 13th Avenue, completion of the Roosevelt Path from Maple Street to Highway 99, Safe Routes to School projects in a few different parts of Eugene, including on Marshall Street in the Bethel neighborhood, and Northeast Livable Streets, which will create neighborhood greenways and enhance pedestrian crossings in the neighborhoods on the other side of the river. Lastly, at some point, we will bring transportation system plan amendments to the Planning Commission and Council for adoption. And at a minimum, these will be related to Vision Zero, autonomous and electric vehicles, and performance measures. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Chelsea to finish up.
So to recap today, we heard details about the TSP implementation plan and the EV strategy. At this time, we are moving forward with the modeling Rob described and implementing the EV strategy as it's written. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be coming back to you several times this fall to discuss the CAP 2.0. Our next work session is scheduled for October 28th. During the discussion today, it would be helpful to hear feedback and questions about these items. In addition, it would be helpful to know if there's anything else you would like us to bring back around the 2.0 related to transportation or just in general. Our hope is to complete the planning process by the end of this calendar year, so hopefully in December before you go on break. Thank you.
Okay, that is really interesting and a lot of information. So I have Greg raising his hand. Anybody else? Alan? Okay. Take it away, Greg.
Here's the $64,000 question. What happens if we're not making significant progress toward our 2030 goals? Is there an interim strategy that you guys are thinking about, particularly around the installation of EV charging stations? Now, I know that the technology is moving very quickly, but maybe not fast enough to get people to start buying more electric vehicles instead of the internal combustion engine.
Sure. So the 2030 goals are set by the CRO, right? And so in particular, I think you're asking about the EV strategy?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Who's going to pay for the installation of that EV infrastructure?
part of the strategy is to explore, I believe, Rob, you can chime in, whether that's what infrastructure the city needs to put in, and then to look at other options, what goes in private business and so on, and how do we work on partnerships. We don't have all the details fleshed out, and part of the details that we did highlight today are that we need to come up with some tracking components and measurement components, and we can come back with that information. We agree there needs to be some benchmarking along the way.
I mean, we get beat up a lot about, us not moving towards our CRO goals fast enough. Would it be prudent for us to issue a report card every year? Letting folks know where we are, how we're planning to get to our goals, just kind of outlining those benchmarks. I think it's important because we get a lot of people that come up here and there's,
I can weigh in a little
very
bit.
good.
I think partly, I think it would be possible to issue a report card, a periodic, could be annual, and I think that would be part of, as we take a look at what are those outcomes that we're measuring, performances that we want to measure, that there's some agreement about which of those then actually incorporate into a report card, as well as there'll be others that'll get measured just from an operational perspective. So I think that would be an appropriate conversation to have.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, this is a great report, great progress from the last time we had a report on this. Lots of good work. We've already done a lot of this, but as Greg said, we don't really get our message out. It's a perennial problem with the city about talking about the things that we do that are really that are really good, and providing that information to people so that we know what we've done. And talked about a report card. We talked about an IOA thermometer kind of thing, so we can track how we're doing along the way. And we don't do a very good job at that, and I think we need to do that much, much better than we already do. So there's many activities here, and lots to work on. I'll point out that there are many co-benefits to all the things that we're talking about in this strategies, of these strategies, that that when they, along with reduced greenhouse gases, we also see lower costs to individuals and to companies. We see less congestion. We see reduced pollution. We see increased health and lowered healthcare costs. When we did the scenario planning at the MPO level, we concluded that it was a $25 million reduction in healthcare costs on an annual basis that we would see because of the scenario of implementing lower greenhouse gas emission types of systems in our planning and transportation system combined. And that all leads to increased profitability. And we don't always quantify those things, but we should, and we're getting better at it. And we don't put numbers on them, so we end up only, so my guess is that all of those benefits, the benefits of greenhouse gases plus the co-benefits far outweigh the cost of what we're talking about. And beside that, when we talk about this, we only talk about half the question. We only talk about what does it cost to do this? We don't talk about the benefits, and we don't talk about all of the co-benefit values, but we also don't talk about what doing this instead of doing what? Doing nothing is not an option. We are going to be impacted by greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, and we are going to spend an enormous amount of money. In the United States, we're going to spend trillions and trillions of dollars to mitigate and adapt to, just adapt to the climate change impacts. And so asking only half the question of what does it cost, it's always what does it cost compared to what? And so we always have to keep that in mind, that it's not just a cost, it's compared to what else we would be doing if we don't take this on. And it's much, much cheaper to mitigate than it is to adapt. And adaptation doesn't always work. I think the EV strategy is a good one to start with. It's a tough one to get a handle on and where we're going. The folks at Odo that work for me work on this stuff, and they tell me that about 2028 is when the flipping point happens between where EVs become more cost effective than the combustion vehicles because of the cost of batteries dropping and the impact of batteries getting better. And I'll need another round, but one more thing. I was in San Diego recently and they have a great scooter program, electric scooter program. I was there with my brother and we went to dinner, and we rode all the way across town in downtown San Diego in traffic on these little scooters, and they are a blast. And they're really effective way of getting around.
All right, Claire.
Well, I appreciate the report. I appreciate pulling together our transportation system plan and our climate recovery goals and a combined presentation that kind of brings those two pieces together. I think that's exactly how we should be looking at these things. I am going to raise a hot topic in terms of autonomous vehicles. I don't know a ton about the technology behind that, but my understanding is that 5G implementation is directly related to the hopes for implementing autonomous vehicles. So I'd love to have that verified if you know, and if you don't, you could maybe follow up. But that is my understanding, that that's part of the impetus for that, is to create a network that can then interact with the autonomous vehicles out on the roads. Kind of chiming in on what Alan was saying, you know, we just got this great report on our rivers to ridges and all of that important work. Enhancing our natural environment obviously is directly implicated by the effects of climate change. And so here we have, you know, multi-million-dollar investment in our parks and recreation system. And we wouldn't want to see that just, you know, completely thrown into chaos because we're not able to get a grip on this other huge issue with climate change. And talking about costs and investments, you know, it just occurred to me as Alan was citing a statistic that says, you know, the improved health of increased walking and biking reduces medical costs by certain amounts. That improved health would also, I would think, mean fewer trips to seek medical care, which also compounds the effects of reducing our carbon footprint. And it also makes me think about, you know, the work we're doing around trying to address homelessness. And oftentimes we talk about the costs of the use of emergency services, the use of an emergency room, and how you can reduce that by providing people with housing. Well, the city doesn't pick up the cost of the use of that emergency room, but we are using public dollars to try to address the issue. So they're not equally necessarily in our ledger how we're experiencing the benefits, but it's still an overall value to the community. So I think that's the same idea with our investments, and what they produce in terms of a benefit is I think widely shared. So thank you.
Chris.
Thank you. This is really helpful, and I'm intrigued with the notion of how do we communicate the complexity of this stuff to folks in the community so they understand what we're trying to do and where we are in that progress. And the notion of some sort of a report card or way of reporting, I think, is a good one. I think a report card is kind of the snapshot in time, where what might actually be even more helpful would be something more like a dashboard, where you can say, this is the goal we're trying to get to. And we set a CRO. We know what the goal is. We haven't really changed that goal. But there's a number of variables involved in how you get to that goal. One of them is, who are the players? One of them is, how much is it going to cost? Another one is, how fast are you going to go to get there? You can go breakneck. You can go slower. You can go at a medium pace. One involves maybe more money, more disruption to the community, whereas another one might be cheaper and involve less disruption. I think it's important that we clarify that we've not changed the goal. The goal is still the goal, but that there's a variety of ways you can get there, some faster, some slower, some more expensive, some less expensive. And I know you're probably going to go into that in much more detail later on, but in terms of the conversation around a dashboard, it might be helpful for us as a council to provide direction on what is the timeline. And I don't mean 2030, that's a set date, but in terms of the timeline along the way. Do we do a lot now and then less later? Do we do less now and a lot later? How does that work? Another thing that we've not really wrestled with is the cost implications, because each one of those vectors has a different cost associated with it. And then I would imagine the cost is very great. The variation in cost is very great. And we as a council need to be able to say, this is the cost to get to that target that we're comfortable with. Because it could be very high cost or it could be very low cost. We invest in buying everybody in Eugene an electric vehicle, that's one cost. Or we may say, nah, we're gonna pursue a different. So I would need to know what those cost variables are. And then perhaps a final one might be the disruption to the community. There are some folks who would say, you know what, any disruption is fine as long as we get to the goal quickly. Others might say, I don't want any disruption at all. So as far as I'm concerned, the planet can burn because I don't want any disruption in my life. Somewhere between those two extremes is the level of disruption we as a council will be comfortable with, and we need to figure out what that level is. So I'm getting at what the dashboard can do, which is to say, our policy is we're going to get to this goal, but these are the variables that are in play in order to get us to that goal in a way that's the most cost-effective, least disruptive, expeditious, and still gets us to that goal.
Hey, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. It's over here, sorry. Yeah, I made that motion a while back when we had the transportation system plan in front of us on autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles so that we know exactly what you're asking for, and I agree with you 100%. We need to have a very clear idea as soon as humanly possible what sort of infrastructure pieces are required if that changes in the marketplace without us, if, you know, those things are connected and have a danger to them that we want to avoid. All of the pieces that play into what I think we will see in the future, we need to be cognizant of as quickly as possible. So I'm glad that LCOG stuff is moving forward and that we're going to start getting some of that information with the university folks too. Please check my math on this if I'm right. So if we need to fill the gap by eliminating 790,000 metric tons CO2, and we can, for every 5,000 currently gas-burning automobiles, replace them with something else like an electric car. If we could replace 100,000 of them, that's 400 and some, roughly, maybe almost 500,000 metric tons of carbon that would eliminate. Do I have that right? 100,000 electric vehicles? Or 100,000, let me say this correctly, gas-powered vehicles currently operating that would no longer need to.
I'm trying to do my math on the fly as well.
So the way I do that math, that's the way it comes out. It would come out to about half of our gap. Here's why I bring that up. We're about, and I'm not trying to throw sand in the gears of other people's work. What we're going to do in another area, I think, is not getting us to these goals. We're about to talk about moving ahead and the LTD projects to expand 5 new MX lines with fossil fuel burning vehicles. Corridors. Forgive me. Corridors. But the vehicles will be mass transit vehicles, and that will be the goal we're trying to do, is get more people into mass transit vehicles that burn fossil fuels. I still contend that if what we did instead, and it's funny, there's, as you know, they produce some electric vehicles in our marketplace, and for the cost of West Eugene MX, you could buy 10,000 electric vehicles, just like them, and replace LTD with a series of 10,000 individually publicly owned electric cars. And you could call them up like, you know, like you would an Uber, or perhaps reserve them in such a way, or like the scooter program we're going to have around here, maybe find a distribution system that individual people could rent them or borrow them or use them. I think that's I think what we're talking about with moving ahead is spending $500 million to build this system that won't reduce carbon the way we'd like to if instead we were using independent individual electric vehicles, which I think is the right way to go.
Just a couple of things. LTD is moving towards purchasing electric buses. So it's conceivable that at some point in the future, they will be buying electric buses for MX or their enhanced corridors. And they already have some. I saw one just the other day. They're actually operating now. So that there is the potential that these corridors could be electric buses. And then the funding streams for, like, say, moving ahead, or if you look at how they funded the MX corridors that were already built, was with Federal Transit Administration funds that are not geared towards what you're suggesting. So, you know, I think all the ideas you have really fit well with our electric vehicle strategy around having shared electric vehicles and helping people to buy their own electric vehicles. And those are, you know, those are really important parts of this overall vision.
I have more, so a second round,
All right.
please, to just finish it off.
Perfect. So, all right, I have Betty for a first round and 3 others for a second round. Go for it, Betty.
I'm the only one left. Okay. First, the scooters. I assume that I hear from constituents that we're in the process of instituting a scooter program. Is that right?
I can give you a very brief update on that. So right now, we're doing some public outreach through the Engage Eugene platform, and we're asking people if the idea is to have a pilot program to test out electric scooters in Eugene, similar to what they've done in Portland, for a period of like 6 to 12 months. So right now, we're getting public feedback on what kinds of criteria we should use in selecting one or more companies to operate electric scooters in Eugene. So the criteria could be around how well do they educate their users or even penalize them when they're blocking sidewalks or parking the scooters in a way that blocks sidewalks. What's the life cycle of the scooter in terms of, like, is it how long does it last? Where are people allowed to park the scooter? So there's a whole range of issues on which we're asking for public input. We're also asking for public input on a potential code change to allow electric scooters and other forms of electric micromobility, like electric skateboards, on our shared use paths. Currently, electric bicycles are allowed on our shared use paths, but electric scooters are not. And then the idea is that we'll come and give the city council an update on what we heard from the community and talk about the potential code change either later this year or early next year, with the goal of issuing a request for proposals to potential scooter companies that they could launch next spring or summer. And that's where we're at.
It seems to me this is out of order, that council should have discussed whether we want to do this or not before staff is deciding with whom we want to do it. I'm hearing from a lot of people who are very concerned about the hazards of electric scooters. And I've experienced it myself in Portland. It's difficult to be a pedestrian with a lot of electric scooters around.
Yeah, I would just offer a couple things. One is, it is a little bit of that balance between, council's already made some policies around how do we increase different modes of transportation throughout the community to meet any numbers of goals. So this is an example of trying to implement a policy that's already currently on the books by the council. The other piece of that is then to have enough information so when we come back to the council, as Rob talked about, there's enough information that you can actually make some decisions around that moving forward, as opposed to just having a general conversation without having a full breadth of experience and information from other communities. And so from my perspective, saying, yes, let's go ahead and start to explore it, it's really because of those two things. There is policy on the books, and then two, trying to ensure there's enough information for council to actually be able to analyze and digest before we actually do move forward. So that's why we're out there right now.
Okay, so you're saying because we have a policy of wanting to reduce gas-powered the use of carbon, that council can go ahead with the electric scooter, staff can go ahead with the electric scooter plans.
Well, what we're saying is because of the policies, we do think we have a responsibility to try to find ways to meet that policy. This is one of those.
Okay, but I think maybe we should say, does council approve of this kind of policy?
Okay, my guess is we're not going to
Kind of
resolve our
action, I
differences
guess.
at the moment, but that, I'm just telling you, that's why I gave them the
Okay.
go-ahead to move forward on exploring that.
Okay, thank you. And I have a lot of time. Another thing I'm concerned about, I'm just starting to hear that people say the bus route on the east and west Amazon is going to be cut next year. And that seems to be, that will cause more people to have to drive their cars if that's true.
So that's
You know
part
whether
of.
that's true?
That's part of a proposal that Lane Transit District has called Transit Tomorrow. And the idea is to focus on the core corridors and move to 15-minute service on those corridors. They're going to be here to present on that in mid-November. And you'll have an opportunity to ask them about that at that meeting.
It would, we already have very poor bus service in South Eugene, as you probably know. And so people who are hearing about this are really alarmed that one route might be cut. I'm having visions of people competing for electric charging stations after a while. I know some people who don't buy gas anymore and find stations, but if everybody has a little scooter or an electric vehicle, I wonder how we're going to regulate the use of those things.
I mean, it's all in our electric vehicle strategy, so I'd encourage you to look at that. I mean, how to, like, one of the actions that I mentioned was around how do we regulate the use of the chargers in our city-owned garages so that one person doesn't just park and use the charger all day. We want, once they're, and there's like smartphone apps that could tell you, oh, your vehicle's full, please go move it so that you're opening up the charger for somebody else to use. But that's a real issue.
We'll have traffic jams in the parking garages.
Would be a good problem to have, right?
Maybe. I don't know whether it's a good thing or not. I think also if we make, well, the scooters are a hazard for pedestrians, so that, and we want more people to walk too. So you might be discouraged from walking if it gets too dangerous. And I wonder if if you're looking at ways to make it easier for pedestrians to get around, like footpaths between places.
We are. That's part of the transportation system plan that calls for a lot of sidewalk infill in Eugene. We also, the projects aren't in the plan, but we build a lot of safe pedestrian crossings because that's really where people are most exposed to traffic is when they're crossing the street. And so there's a lot of work going on around the city to build safer pedestrian crossings. We just partnered with a developer on Franklin Boulevard to put a new pedestrian signal in for that new apartment building so that the people who live there can safely walk to campus. But that's definitely a big priority around making it easier to walk.
Start downtown too.
Sorry?
You could start downtown too, making it easier to cross the street without getting hit by a car. For example, at 10th and Oak is a good spot.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's all.
Okay, I have 4 counselors in the queue. I just want to ask just a really quick question. You mentioned this report, Navigating New Mobility, and that might come back to council at some point in the future. So that, I would just say that it sounds like that report might respond to a lot of the things we're hearing around the table, so.
And we'll post it online soon, and I'll send you a link to that and do a city council newsletter article too.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds helpful. Okay, I have Alan, then Greg, then Mike, then Claire.
Yeah, one of the things that where scooters have been successful is they don't allow them on sidewalks. Enforcing that is a problem, but doing it very forthrightly at the beginning will get the message across, and making the fines strong enough, people will stop doing that. So they need to be in bike lanes and streets only, and then they're much bigger. You know, to use an analogy Chris often uses, when the first cars came out, and where everybody's riding around in buggies with horses, they called them death machines because they were zooming around all over the place, killing people. So the EV strategy that we have lined out is a good one. We already started that a couple of years back when we added into the MUPD provisions that every one of the MUPDs needs to be EV ready. We might want to start thinking about that in terms of code and making that part of our infrastructure requirements in our city as well. That we need to be able to have, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. We need to have the charging stations and we need to have the EVs. And if we one gets ahead of the other one, it becomes problematic. So they both need to be going forward in parallel. I understand the frustration that people have about the pace that we're doing, and that this is a crisis, and then we need to deal with it yesterday, and that we're just not getting there fast enough. So I guess the challenge to the 350.org people is that really we need to be working with the city to set up the dashboard and set up the information campaign and get the right information out there and publicize it so that we can tell that story. It's fine to talk about all the things that we need to do, but we also need to talk about and track the progress that we're making, because that's very important for people to see progress as we move forward so they can do even more and be inspired to do that. It's a critical element to spur our community to do more, because that big bucket out there of the community part action that needs to occur needs to be spurred by information, and success builds success. So that's a critically important part, and I hope you'll focus a lot of attention on that in the future. And the pace does need to increase. So while we're seeing the impacts of climate change, like more wildfires and increased impacts on our rainfall and our snowpack and the droughts and all the dead trees that are dying all over the places, and in other places sea level rise, we don't seem to be able to reconcile that with what we need to do. And part of the problem is because we have the costs are often diffuse and not necessarily directly impacting people. And so, we end up not talking about it correctly, and we're ending up with this weird conversation where we're saying that it's really not cost effective to save ourselves, which is kind of a stupid, bizarre thing to conclude. So I think another lesson learned from the city halls is that if the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets. So early actions are cheaper than later actions. And so transportation is so huge. It's not an or, it's an and conversation. We need to do all of the above, not just one or the other. It's that silver buckshot that we need to get there and do it all.
Greg.
So
That's a
I have a broader question in terms of the fact that the city of Eugene is not a silo, okay? And, we have partners. There's Lane County, there's Springfield. I know that at LCC, we've installed, charging stations, all of that kind of thing. And we have a fairly robust plan to reduce our carbon footprint. But how have any conversations gone with Lane County or maybe some of the other big employment centers that we have around here? I know this Sacred Heart is one. They don't just service people in Springfield, but they service folks in Eugene and, across the region. What are those conversations like? And you think we can make any progress with one or more of those entities?
I think we have conversations coming up with a lot of those entities, and it really speaks to the power of the Eugene Climate Collaborative and the work we've done to sort of lay out this climate action plan. Some of the organizations you mentioned, Lane County, LCC, Peace Health, are all part of that collaborative. And we have a conversation scheduled in early November to come together to say, here's our EV plan. Let's talk about, does this work for you? Where can you plug into this plan? So we're continuing, and we've done that already with eWeb to understand they're huge leaders around EV. So what are you doing? So those conversations are happening, and I think they're a result of the way that you all had to structure this process. The foundation's laid so we can have those conversations with large organizations. There's still a lot of work to be done, but that foundation is laid.
And how can we get them to buy into our goals?
Those are difficult conversations for sure. And I think that we could really get stuck there. We need everyone to buy into the CRO goals, right? I think what's more important and really impactful at the end of the day is to find points where those organizations are ready to move forward. So EVs is a great example for, say, LCC. I know they're really interested in that. So let's figure out how we can partner there. And if that's where they really want to run, let's support them and move forward there and find the leverage points with each organization.
So we would partner around strategies, not necessarily goals.
We're open to to folks aligning with our goals, but I think the more important thing that we're hearing from community is to get to work on those strategies and figure out how we can move forward.
Okay, Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm glad, Rob, that you brought up money right at the end of that, right there, because that was where I was going next. And Chris, what he said earlier as well, with regard to the trade-off effect of what do you spend money on and what's of value and what isn't. What was the final expenditure for the corridor and everything involved for the West 11 MX?
It was around $100 million.
That's what I thought. Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't wrong about that. And with all 5 of the corridors for moving ahead, the proposed expenditure is within the range of,
I may not have this quite right, but I think it may be around 150 million for all enhanced to around 350 million for all MX, something arranged like that. It's definitely less expensive than West Eugene MX. Even for the MX alternatives, we took more of a surgical approach to where do we really need to have dedicated lanes and where can we do it without having like huge impacts to businesses and property owners.
right. And all of that, several hundred million, a couple hundred million at least, to build all 5 of those. It's going to come from federal dollars. That's the majority of it.
One thing I just want to make clear too is with moving ahead, it's not just transit improvements, it's also pedestrian and bicycle improvements on all of the corridors.
Right, sure. And I have to tell you, as we get to that conversation, I'm entirely in favor of the infrastructure changes for making the corridor more travel friendly in the ways that you just mentioned. I just think the use of buses as opposed to individual vehicles, and in this case specifically electric vehicles, is A, dramatically less expensive, and B, better for the environment. And lastly, I would say I wouldn't put it out there as we have these kind of funds already kind of with a process for creating the opportunity for buses, because that's very true. But I sense that in Washington, D.C. next year, there won't be a lot of Republicans and Democrats holding hands and, singing Kumbaya and getting lots done together. I don't sense that's what next year is going to look like. However, I would say that if there was one area where they could work together, it's around transportation infrastructure. And if only we had a local representative that was, I don't know, chair of the Transportation Committee in the House, maybe we could actually take this idea that might be a little bit out there, where we actually have a company here that makes electric vehicles, and put this out as a piece of what he's doing as an alternative. I absolutely believe we have all the pieces in order to make that a reality, and we can get to half of our gap in the process of doing so.
Right. So one thing I just want to make clear is that previously Lane Transit District had to only contribute, I think it was 20% of the cost of the MX projects. It's a program called Small Starts, and now it's a 50% required match. 80-20 before, now it's 50-50. So it's not as good as it used to be. The other thing to keep in mind is imagine if we took all the 35 to 40,000 people that ride LTD every day and put them in small electric vehicles, we'd probably have gridlock on our streets. So some of you probably saw Jarrett Walker, who is an expert on transit, when he spoke in Eugene, and I can't do justice to what he says, but he makes a really good case for why public transportation works a lot better than having people roving around in fleets, so whether they're autonomous vehicles or personal vehicles. Sure. Now, still, we want people to have their own personal electric vehicles. We want Uber and Lyft to be using electric vehicles. Eventually, when they're autonomous, we want those to be electric. There's no question those would be good things over having all those vehicles be internal combustion.
I appreciate that. It always kind of challenges me a little bit when I feel like the staff interaction with some of the ideas that I'm throwing out sounds more like a debate, and that's challenging for me. I would suggest to you that the technology itself that I have read about allows that we will see a capacity for a different manner of traffic traveling together, especially with autonomous vehicles and distance between vehicles, number one. And number two, we're never going to see more than 8, maybe 10% of people travel together all in the same vehicle. The public in the West simply won't do it. So we could spend all that money one way, or we can spend it the way that people are comfortable traveling and find better ways to limit the CO2 the way they would prefer to do it. Thank you. I'm out of time.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you. I actually appreciate staff's responses, even though it might sound like debating. And I just have to say, we had a similar conversation at a Lane Act meeting in a few months past when the mayor of Junction City objected to a transit pilot project that they were recommending funding for, saying for the cost of these projects, I could buy all of my residents a car and they could drive themselves around. And I couldn't help but point out not only what staff has pointed out about the congestion, but my point that I made was even if we could supply every resident with their own electric vehicle, not every resident can operate a vehicle. We have children, we have seniors, we have people with disabilities, and those folks need transportation options. So public transportation in the form of a bus or an MX is going to be necessary as part of our investment. And improving that investment, we may choose MX, we may not choose MX, but I don't think it's reasonable to say, well, we could just replace all that with an Archimoto. Because unless we actually have an actual safe system of autonomous vehicles that can avoid the gridlock, that is just not going to be practical. And then I just wanted to revisit the concern around the electric scooter and just make sure we all understand what my understanding is. Staff is gathering information right now and feedback from community or input from community about a possible pilot project, which would be a test that would be time limited, and then there'd be some results from that test, and then that would be brought to council, and we would weigh in on, yeah, the test had these results, we like it, go forward, or the test had these results, we don't like it, don't do it. Is that an accurate kind of
roughly
reflection of
speaking,
the plan?
deferring to what the city manager said earlier about the different roles, but that's the basic idea is that the city would evaluate the results to determine whether to move forward with a more permanent program.
So you're looking at the idea of launching a pilot project, a test,
Right.
that you would then gather data from. It might be a success, it might be a failure, it might be a mixed bag.
Right.
And then staff will evaluate, perhaps city council will weigh in. There'll be some decision made in the future about whether or not to engage with a vendor beyond a pilot project or not.
Exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're there. I want to just close with piggyback on a couple of comments that Alan made and that Chris made, and really this sort of question around the metrics and the dashboard and how we measure it. And Alan had made the point that and you made the point in your presentation that the consumption bucket is really the big one, and transportation is the big one that we can have an impact as a city in terms of how we invest. And I wonder in terms of the metrics if there isn't a way of doing it, not trying to do it exhaustively, all of the metrics that you could possibly, or trying to embrace the whole thing, but if we couldn't in different areas pick sort of the canary in the coal mine metrics, like pick a couple that are easily measurable, where we think there's adjustment, so that we're not trying to do it all, but we're doing enough of it that we could come back periodically, so there would be a dashboard that gets updated, but it's not so detailed that no one's ever going to look at it or understand it, right? But it could be the things that we already measure. I mean, we already measure vehicle miles traveled. We can have that kind of data. We can measure how much people are, with the impacts of safe routes to schools. How many more kids are walking to school instead of getting a ride with their parents? I mean, it feels to me like there's some easier ones to track that we could do that more quickly without having to do a deep dive into a lot of intense data to figure out how to report that, and that would help the public see our progress and understand what our measurements are. And then they can weigh in on Engage Eugene if they think there are other measurements that we might want to look at. But at least we'd get a start without spending too much time like trying to explore serious data sets, right? And so that's just my thought. Sooner is better. Simpler is better, to quote my esteemed colleague. Simpler and smaller. Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent report. Eager to hear more and to see the things that you posted for us. So thank you so much. And I'm not quite adjourning this meeting yet, but you may, you're relieved of your hot seat. City Manager, this is our final work session with you, and we wanted to take a couple of minutes to thank you for the way you have guided and supported this council, both with a sense of humor and with calm, deliberative discussion, and always keeping us sort of on track. And so Chris has a particular proclamation to read.
Yes, in fact, I would like to propose a resolution recognizing John Reese for his contributions to the city of Eugene upon his retirement from service as Eugene City Manager. And if I get a second.
Second?
Here, so you can follow along.
Yeah.
I did not make a copy for John because parts of this are intended to be a surprise. Don't have a resolution number yet, but this is a resolution recognizing John Reese for his contributions to the city of Eugene upon his retirement from service as Eugene City Manager. The City Council of the City of Eugene finds that, whereas John Reese has provided service to the city of Eugene for more than 11 years, achieving an amazing tenure and acceptance by Eugene standards, and whereas John has overseen the operation of the city in a professional and competent manner, winning awards and recognition, maintaining the trust and confidence of the City Council, and successfully concealing his secret role in running the city to achieve world domination. And whereas John has faithfully implemented the policies and directions of the Eugene City Council, including helping the council find a way to establish areas of priority without actually using the word priority. And whereas over the tenure of his appointment, John has shown great patience, conducting himself in a calm and deliberate manner, resisting the temptation to show up drunk, swear like a sailor, or physically assault city councilors or members of the public at council meetings. And whereas John has maintained cordial relationships with other public officials and managers, nodding thoughtfully as they speak and showing them appropriate respect while he quietly sleeps. And whereas John has assembled an executive staff of highly competent division managers capable of covering for him while he sits in his office thinking, draws on the whiteboard, photocopies last year's budget and changes the dates, or has lunch with important people. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the City Council of the City of Eugene, a municipal corporation of the state of Oregon, as follows. 1, the City Council wishes John Reese a heartfelt and warm farewell as he vacates his office by 5 p.m. Friday, doesn't touch anything as he leaves the premises, and doesn't let the door hit him in the backside on the way out. And 2, the City Council will not actively pursue criminal charges if he agrees to put all his plastic straws and single-use utensils into a recyclable paper bag and leaves it under the second bench at the Rose Garden. And finally, the City Council sincerely and gratefully thanks John for his unselfish and faithful service to the community, exhibiting the best qualities of honor, courage, and understanding. You have been a great friend, and you will be missed.
Thank you very much.
And
I think I should say thank you.
We haven't approved it yet.
It's going to be a vote here too, brother.
it's going to be a vote. Would you like to vote? Everyone prepared to vote to support the resolution?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
All in favor? 1, 2,
There we
3,
have it.
4, 5, 6. Oh, you were hesitating.
Just being
I
different.
didn't think it was strong enough.
What a surprise.
So we have another special way to honor you, John, in honor of all the pies you've had to slice, the budget pies and other pies.
I picked the apples last night, too. Thank you. Just for that.
Wow.
And then one more gift from council.
This is from all of council, wishing you the best of luck in your future endeavors. Make them great.
And actually, I think we should compel you to open it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Should eat the pie.
Yeah.
We add it to the supply of.
Moving away.
Don't worry.
It won't explode.
It
Yeah,
won't
it's,
blow up, John.
Just rip it.
You can recycle it.
opening it in an orderly
Right, we're
and
going to find that
military
under the
manner.
second bench in the Rose Garden.
What color's your parachute? Job Hunter's Handbook. Perfect, thank you.
In a year.
Yes, it's got to be a year, actually.
In a year.
Well, thank you very much. As I mentioned last night, it has been a wonderful ride with all of you, and I do really appreciate the elected officials I've had a chance to work with. You're all of extremely good character and great intent for this community, and we're just fortunate to have you. So thank you very much. It's been extremely satisfying.
Hey, clap.
The only time we violated the classroom rule.
Wow, that looks great.
And you got to eat one of Mike's pies that we've heard so much
Finally,
about.
finally. Get to eat one of your
He'll get to eat one of the pies you brag so much about.
We never get one.
Thank you very much.
It's my favorite pie.
I'll get that back to you.
We're gonna have some wine and
Well, yeah.
we'll figure that out.
Oh, okay.
Hear you, I'm sorry, I'm happy.
My pen is not working too well. Do you have a? It will if I bear down on it.